Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thanks for joining us. My name is Robert. I'll be your host. This is Édouard Manet and Impressionism at the National Gallery of Art. Let's go ahead and get started. My adopted hometown of Washington, D.C. is a great place to visit. They have a lot of cool things to see and do. And of course, they have a lot of excellent art museums, in particular, the National Gallery of Art, one of my favorites. So we're going to be talking about the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. today. And in particular, we're going to be discussing Édouard Manet. The NGA, as it's sometimes referred to, has one of the world's largest collection of Manet paintings. They have 17 of his paintings in their illustrious Impressionism collection. So we'll talk about Édouard Manet in the context of the National Gallery of Art. Now, Manet is known as the painter of modern life. And when we say modern life, we don't mean modern in the 2023 context, of course. We mean modern in the times that he was alive and living in Paris, France. So that's kind of the one big takeaways of today's program is Édouard Manet is known as the painter of modern life. And here are some of his more well-known works at other museums outside of National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. that you probably have seen before. And the reason why we're having these series of programs on Manet, this is kind of like a whole, over a year-long celebration we were doing to celebrate Manet's 190th birthday last year in January of 2022. So we were celebrating his 190th birthday for the past 1 year plus. And if you missed it, we had a previous program like this. We talked about Manet's work that was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Now that particular program we won't be repeating anytime in the near future, but it was recorded and it's on our Washington, D.C. History and Culture YouTube channel. You can find it there. And then we have another program on Manet. We talk about his artwork at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. And that program will be repeated. We had it in January, this past January, but it'll be repeated in April. And when we do it in April, we'll also record it for our YouTube channel. So it's not on our YouTube channel just yet, but it'll be there after sometime April of 2023, or you can join us live. But today's program, we'll be talking about Manet at the National Gallery of Art. So let's go ahead and get started. My name is Robert Kelleman. I'll be your host. Thanks so much for joining us. A little bit about myself. I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan. I was an art history major in college at the University of Michigan, specialized in American art and Impressionism. And then I spent the first 2 years of my career working at the Detroit Institute of Arts. The past many years, I've lived in Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, California, and Dallas, Texas. So thank you all for being here. And we have our awesome co-host joining us once again today, Patty from Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Hi, Patty. Do you want to say hello and introduce yourself?
Yes. Hello, everybody. We have a couple of people from my neighborhood and from Boston here today, and at least one who says Manet is her all-time favorite painter. So you've got a great audience. Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you.
Several people mentioning the Barnes today too, so which also was a great experience.
Oh, well, thank you. So Patty, for our geography lesson for today, how far away is Portsmouth, New Hampshire from Boston if traffic is cooperating?
I would say 45 minutes, but
oh, wow.
Finding a day when the traffic is cooperating is getting harder and harder as as time goes on. But a lot of people did enjoy a lot of the lockdown, that some of the museums did have timed entries after the first year because of that, because it was so much easier to get to where you wanted to go and to be able to see what you wanted to see. So
okay.
I guess we'll be going back to quote unquote normal, whatever that is going to be now. So
normal. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you. Thanks, Patty. Thanks, of course, for joining us. As always, Patty always does a fabulous job. And so another kind of key takeaway for today's program will be, what makes a Manet painting a Manet? I think his style is not quite as distinctive as maybe Monet's or Van Gogh's or some of the other artists you might be familiar with. We'll be talking about that. What actually makes a Manet painting a Manet? So something to keep in mind. And really, it kind of, the main thing for me is the fact that he's this painting of quote unquote modern life. And again, modern in the terms of what was going on in Paris while he was living there. And these are two of the more famous works of his at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And then in previous programs like this, people have asked if I could kind of summarize, like, what are the key takeaways that we'll be talking about. So if you want to take a picture of this with your phone or a screenshot, you're more than welcome to do so. I'll put this up at the end of the program as a second time if you don't get a chance to look at it now. But real briefly, Édouard Manet, kind of the brief Cliff's Notes version of his life and career. He was born and raised in Paris. Not all that uncommon, but there's a lot of famous artists that lived in Paris that moved there from somewhere else, like Vincent van Gogh. He was Dutch. Picasso was Spanish, et cetera, et cetera. He began his career as a traditional painter before Impressionism. So Manet was already an established artist before Impressionism came along. And so he really kind of bridges traditional art and Impressionism, which is interesting. And then he was significantly influenced by Spanish art. And we'll be talking a little bit about that. In particular, he was influenced by Velázquez and Goya, two great Spanish artists. And then as an established artist, he mentored a lot of the famous Impressionists. So he was older, more established, more experienced than artists like Monet and Renoir and Morisot. And so he really mentored them along in the early stages of the career. His artistic style is somewhat hard to categorize just because it is a little bit different and changing. So we'll discuss that. We've already mentioned he's the painter of modern life. Really, his primary subject are what we call genre scenes. And we'll explain exactly what a genre scene is a little bit later. And he focused, of course, on modern and contemporary Paris life. Additional subjects he did were portraits and a lot of still lifes. He wasn't into landscape paintings like many of the Impressionists were. And unfortunately, he died at the age of 51. So there you go. There's Édouard Manet's life in a nutshell. And let's talk about Manet's life and career. And we'll do it mostly like a chronological context. And we'll be looking at the artwork at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., all 17 of his paintings. And we'll also include several other Manet paintings from different museums and collections throughout the world. So you can kind of see how the National Gallery of artworks fit in the context of his entire life and career. So we mentioned earlier that Manet was born in Paris on January 23rd, 1832. And here's his birthplace right here. And this is in Paris and right across the Seine from the Louvre. So very close proximity. And then his gravesite is actually over here, which is across from the Eiffel Tower. So born and raised in the heart of Paris. And his gravesite is also in Paris. And you can actually visit his birthplace, the exterior of it. So he was born in the building that's inside this courtyard here. And again, it was a little over 190 years ago. And they have a historical marker outside signifying this is the place where Manet was born. And this is a private housing complex. So it's not a museum that's open to the public, unfortunately. And they keep the doors shut to keep away those pesky tourists that might pass through. But anyway, if you were to look when they open up the door, this is what it looks like inside. So he was born in this building and spent the first few years of his life there. His family was pretty wealthy. He came from a pretty established background financially, which took kind of some of the pressure off him to support himself as an artist. So here's a nice portrait that he did at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris of his parents. And he did that back in 1860. And then here's a portrait he did of his mother. And notice where this is at. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, which is, Patty, your favorite museum, right? Patty's not very far from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum.
Yes, it's my sentimental favorite, Robert. So
okay, awesome. Well, we include that one just for you.
I leaped in joy when I saw that.
Okay, well, thank you. So again, that's Mrs. Manet, Édouard Manet's mother. Manet's father was a banker. His family came from groups of people that were bankers and businessmen and diplomats and stuff like that. So again, a pretty wealthy upbringing. This is him as a young man. Initially, when he was younger, he thought he might like to join the Navy and become a sailor. So imagine that if he would have done that, art world would have turned out very differently. And then let's take a look at some of his early works. And so what I did is I broke up the 17 paintings there at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. by Manet into categories, and they're mostly in chronological order. So let's talk about these three works first. These are his early works from the early days of his career, and you can really see the heavy Spanish influences that really impact Manet. He was fascinated by Spanish art and history and culture, etc. And so here's our first one. This is called The Old Musician from 1862. And this painting relates to a very ambitious architectural program or initiative by a Frenchman named Baron Haussmann. And he's really depicting the contemporary Paris in the 1860s. Now, if you're an American, 1860s, early 1860s, of course, is the time of the American Civil War. Doesn't have anything to do with Manet, but just to give you that historical context of what kind of time frame we're talking about. And here is the painting. So you have this seated musician figure surrounded by several other people. Now, the National Gallery of Art has a few videos that they've put out, and they're more geared towards children, but I like how they kind of briefly and concisely summarize the key points of a painting. So let's listen to this. It is for children, but I feel like it does a good job describing the painting, and us adults can learn a few things from it as well. So this is the NGA's kids programs talking about this particular painting.
Bonjour, may I play you a tune? My name is Jean Lagraine. I was a street musician in Paris 100 years ago. I earned my living performing for passers-by. I also worked as a model for artists, like the painter Édouard Manet, who made this picture. If not for him, I might have been forgotten.
Take a closer look at the people who have gathered around the old musician. Find the barefoot girl holding a baby. Beside her are two young boys, one with his arm around the other. A man in a dark cape and top hat watches from behind. And to the far right stands an elderly man with a white beard and long dark topcoat. What a strange group of people to find together in a painting. What could this painting be about? Artist Édouard Manet was interested in capturing the modern world around him. Regularly walking about Paris, he often used people from everyday life as models for his work. And his paintings chronicle the changes taking place in the French capital, which at the time was being transformed into a grand city with tree-lined boulevards, beautiful buildings, and new restaurants and cafes. But you don't see any of them here. That's because Manet is showing the less glamorous side of modern life, painting people from a poor area on the edge of Paris. The old musician plays for passers-by, hoping for money.
Merci.
All right, that was from our friends at the National Gallery of Art, their children's education department. So this is what's known as a genre painting, which is a term you hear frequently in art history. So let's talk about this. What exactly is a genre painting? It's an art form that depicts aspects of everyday life by portraying ordinary people engaged in common activities, as opposed to, say, a king or a queen. One classic definition of a genre scene is that it shows figures to whom no identity can be attached, either individually or collectively, thus distinguishing it from portraits and history painting. So this is a classic example of genre painting. Now, if you were to break up the 17 paintings by Manet, which is a decent sample size, of the 17, 6 of the works are these genre scenes. And then 5 of them are still lifes, 4 are portraits. He did a couple of paintings of animals. So he doesn't do history scenes usually. He did a few, but not very many. He's not really into landscapes. And so this is just a sample size of the National Gallery. but of art in DC. But if you were to expand this out to Manet's whole entire career, the categorization would be very, very similar. So he does really focus on the genre scenes, the still lifes, and the portraits throughout his career. And then this particular initiative that he's painting or depicting, Baron Haussmann's renovation of Paris was a vast public works program commissioned by Emperor Napoleon III between 1853 and 1870. It included the demolition of medieval neighborhoods that were deemed overcrowded and unhealthy, the building of wide avenues, new parks and squares, and the construction of new sewers, fountains, and aqueducts. Haussmann's work was met with fierce opposition, but work on his projects continued. The street plan and distinctive appearance of the center of Paris today are largely the result of Haussmann's renovation. And so these are pictures of what Paris used to look like back in the day, in the mid-1800s. And these neighborhoods were demolished and cleared out, and new wide tree-lined avenues were built in its place. You can still find places like this in Paris, but there are much fewer of them than there were before the renovation project. And so here you go. So this is kind of, if you're a tourist or have kind of visions or images of what Paris looks like, you probably have thoughts like this. And so this comes about during this Napoleon III and Baron Haussmann initiative between 1853 and 1870. And as the description said earlier, there was a lot of public opposition to this taking place. And here's another view. And this actually ends up impacting Manet because he had a small studio in an area that was set to be demolished. So this impacted him significantly. And it's thought that these are probably people that he would have seen either going to or leaving his studio, people that he encountered. So he doesn't identify who the actual individuals are, but there's a video said there's the street musician who's performing for money. It's thought that these are perhaps two circus performers, two young children that were working in the circus. Over here, you have this young woman and she's holding a child. Now notice that she's barefoot. Her clothing is very tattered. Their clothing is also a little bit tattered. Then you have this guy over here is categorized as a drunkard who's maybe perhaps coming home from a long night out. And then you have this woman here with a walking stick. So kind of this unusual variety of figures that Manet has put together. But this is the world that he's seeing and living in at this point in time. Now, he's very wealthy, or pretty wealthy, I should say, just because of his family situation with his parents. But that being said, he's renting this small studio in this neighborhood that is being demolished. So here's the old musician. And like, notice the little details here, like the clothes here are tattered and his shoes are worn. Again, he's just playing for money, and the two small children and the barefoot woman. And there's the star of the show, so to speak, the musician. And then these other figures off to the side. Now this figure made an appearance in another Manet painting. And here it is. It's from Denmark. It was done in 1859. It's the absinthe drinker. So you can see Manet has this figure here. He's got the empty bottle and then his glass of alcohol over here. And then he recreates that figure in the old musician painting. So this one is from a museum in Denmark. It was done in 1859. And then you can see him reappearing here in the Manet painting at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. from 1862. And then there's the figures, close up, and the full view. And so really kind of a classic early Manet painting where he's documenting the things that he's seeing and experiencing in Paris. All right, here's our next one. This is a gentleman who's lost his life in the bullfighting ring, and this is from 1864. Now, we'll talk about the fact that this is a pre-Impressionist painting. Manet is considered an Impressionist artist, but because he began his career before Impressionism, he really bridges pre-Impressionism and Impressionism, and this is also a great example of the Spanish influences that Manet was very fond of. And in a letter that he wrote to a friend of his, Manet said, One of the most beautiful, most curious, and most terrible spectacles one can see is a bullfight. On my return to Paris, I hope to put on canvas the brilliant, flickering, and at the same time dramatic appearance of the ones I've attended. So Manet travels to Spain to learn about the arts. He was really greatly fond of these Spanish artists like Velázquez and Goya, and he wanted to go see their artwork up close in person. Remember, this is before color photography and television and the internet, so it really was much harder to study art, particularly if you wanted to get into more details at that point in time. And so here is our figure, and you can see this gentleman here. He's been killed in the bullfighting ring. You can see he's laying motionless. There's a small amount of blood here. And then he has this flag over here. The flag would be used to wave at the bulls to try and distract them while the activities are taking place in the ring. Now, Manet did a whole series of paintings on Spanish themes, in particular bullfights, and you can see these at other museums. So again, we're going to focus on the artwork at the National Gallery of Art in DC, but I want to include several other paintings just so you can kind of see how everything kind of fits in together, the context, so to speak. So this is a famous painting at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, bullfight from the same time frame, 1865 to 1866. And one of my favorite museums is the Art Institute of Chicago, and they have a bullfight painting from also 1865 to 1866. And then another great place is the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and they have this painting of a matador from 1866 to 1867. And so here you go. So I like to look at art like this, where you're kind of studying or viewing or kind of thinking about several works at the same time. Because if you were to just see one of these paintings by itself randomly in a museum, like, oh, okay, that's a bullfight. But when you start to understand or realize that, oh, okay, he did this on multiple occasions, you can really kind of see what he was trying to accomplish. And so this whole bullfighting theme that Manet was interested in portraying. And here's our poor figure who's lost his life in the deadly bullfighting ring. Now, it's thought that Manet was really influenced by an earlier painting by an unknown Italian artist. The work is known as A Dead Soldier, and it's from 1600s. It's at the National Gallery in London. So that's their painting. And you can see a lot of similarities between this work, which was done a couple hundred years earlier, and the one that we just saw by Manet. And so here you are side by side. So 1600s, unknown Italian artist at the National Gallery in London, 1864, Manet at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Wow, yeah, okay, look at the similarities between those two. Now, there's quite a few differences, but that being said, it's thought that the one influenced the other. A lot of times when artists are starting out their career, like Manet is at this point in time, they're really heavily influenced by other artworks and other artists that have come before them, much more so than they would be, say, later on in their career. They're very, I don't know, impressionable, so to speak, no pun intended. And so here's our two figures. Notice even the position of the right hand is very similar. And there you go. And Manet probably would have most likely or most certainly been familiar with the other artwork just because it's a very famous painting. But he's giving us kind of a contemporary vision of it. And there's our poor guy here. And then I guess one way to think about looking at this painting is what if you flip it sideways? And so there he is laying very peacefully on the ground with his hand on his chest. And again, you can see the pool of blood that has dripped out from him. He was no doubt gored by the bull and died in the ring. And then Manet, interestingly, adds a little bit of color with this pinkish flag. Manet's favorite color was black. That was something I should have included in the summary, because you see black in different shades of black in so many of his paintings throughout his career. And so a good example there. Now, Manet periodically did kind of morbid subjects. This is a painting that's really kind of puzzled art historians. It's called The Suicide, and they're not quite sure when exactly he painted. It's thought in the late 1870s or early 1880s, and it's at a museum in Switzerland, but it's kind of a morbid subject to have this guy who shot himself lying dead on a bed in an apartment. But anyway, that's another Manet painting that he did of kind of a different type of subject, which is maybe different than if you've been on an air program, you talked about Renoir. And Renoir liked to paint happy, pretty, beautiful things like flowers and young ladies and beautiful clothing and stuff like that. So this obviously would not be a Renoir painting, nor would the other one that we just saw a moment ago. And then this was a friend of Manet's who was an actor, and he ended up passing away. And so as kind of a tribute to his friend who passed away, the actor, Manet did this portrait of him. Now, he didn't do it from life because the guy passed away. So he would have looked at photographs to depict him. And here his friend is playing a Shakespearean role. So really a great painting that's a tribute to his friend. And this also is before Impressionism. Impressionism doesn't get started until like the early 1870s. And so the fact that this painting's made several years before that means it's not an Impressionist painting per se. And we were talking at the beginning of the program how it can be challenging to kind of categorize Manet because his style changes a lot. He goes in different directions and does different things. And so here's 4 portraits that he did at the National Gallery of Art. And notice how these are all very 4 different. So this one that we're looking at now from 1866, and then here's 3 others that we'll look at later. And notice how different all 4 of these are. 2 are men, 2 are women. One, the figure is standing and we can see all of him. This is a profile view. He's sitting, she's standing with her arms in front of her. So just really different types of approaches. You would almost think these are 4 different artists, but they are all the same artist, Édouard Manet. And then here's a print of his friend who died suddenly, the actor. And so Manet probably used images like this to do his portrait, since he did this portrait after his friend had passed away. And Manet is friends with a lot of other artists and actors and musicians and literary figures and politicians and all those types of people. Now, as mentioned, Manet was really interested in Spanish art. So if you're at the National Gallery of Art, they have a really fabulous collection from art all over the world. And so you can check out some of these works that potentially influenced Manet. So here's a great painting by Velázquez called The Needle Woman from the mid-1600s. And then here's another artwork by a Spanish artist, Goya, from the early 1800s. And these are 2 artists that really influenced Manet's career, particularly early on in his life. And if you look at these 2 Spanish paintings at the National Gallery of Art and compare them to these 2 early works by Manet that we've been talking about, look at the similarities between these works. They all have a single solitary figure. The background is kind of like a grayish color. There's the lighting provides a great contrast with the colors. There's a lot of blackish gray in the works, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see a lot of influence between these works, the types of things that would have influenced Manet, and these works that are at the National Gallery of Art, even though they were done sometime later. And then here's another work that Manet would have seen on his trip to Paris, or sorry, his trip to Spain. This is Velázquez, and this is one of his most famous portraits. And so you can see this was done in 1635. Now compare this painting to the work that Manet did that we're talking about. And wow, there you go, look at that. So again, you can see a lot of similarities. The black coloring, the single solitary figure, this dramatic lighting, the grayish kind of earth tone background, et cetera, et cetera. And so you can say, oh, okay, yeah, I can kind of see where he got some influences from. And there's a close-up. Oh, Pamela pointed out that people also are expressionless. Yeah, that's very observant of you, Pamela. Thank you. Yeah, that's another kind of thing to characterize these artworks by. Now, this painting has an interesting history before it was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Talk about that in just a moment. There's a close-up. look at the angles of the sword compared to his legs and the feet and the shadow here. So it's kind of busy down in this part of the painting, and perhaps intentionally so, just to keep our visual interest.
Oh, we've gotten a question. We've gotten a question about how he used so many different colors to achieve black. And I like that question because it often comes up with whites, but that's the first time I remember anybody asking it about black.
Oh yeah, people, interjecting like different color shape, different colors in with the black to get that different type of look and feel to it. Mm-hmm.
And that was a characteristic of the development of modern art, was it not?
Oh yeah, because around before this time came along, they started making paints out of artificial materials. So back in the day, it would have been challenging to come up with certain colors. And so with the development of artificial paints, though, in the mid 1800s, it really made the whole rainbow available, the whole spectrum, so to speak. But Manet was really, really into black.
Yeah, and it adds amazing depth and life to the painting.
Mm-hmm. And also makes it really a lot more dramatic too.
Exactly.
Yes. If he was in like a brown clothing, it wouldn't be quite as dramatic.
That really showed up in the contrast between the dead soldier versus the dead bullfighter.
Oh yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah, that one too. Yeah, I mean, it was a good color choice, and perhaps that's why he chose it, because he liked black so much. All right, well, thank you, Patty. Appreciate that. All right, continue on. Patty, jump in whenever you'd like to, as always. So if you've heard of or been to the Biltmore estate, which was completed in 1895, this was actually the previous owner of the painting that we just looked at before it was acquired by the Met. And so the Biltmore estate, one of the grandest homes not in the world, certainly in the United States. It's in North Carolina, in Western North Carolina. So you can visit that at some point in time. But anyway, this home was built in 1895, and they acquired the Manet painting that we just looked at in 1898. And the home was built by George Washington Vanderbilt II and his wife Edith. And they were big art collectors and art patrons. And at the Biltmore, they like to have a lot of great parties and invite people over and do a lot of entertaining. And their house was really a big giant art museum. So if you could imagine going back in time and visiting them and attending one of their parties and getting all dressed up and seeing all this fabulous artwork on the wall in different other locations, you would have seen this painting by Manet before it ended up at the Met. So interesting footnote there. And then for our good friend Patty, thought we'd include another New England painting. So this is at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. And this is a famous painting by Manet, a music lesson from 1870. And again, you can kind of see the black coloring, the Spanish theme of the music and the musicians, and it's these two figures and the dramatic lighting and et cetera, et cetera. So I thought we'd include that one as well. And so again, this is Manet's early works, where you can really see the Spanish influences. So Manet, early on in his career, becomes famous, although actually maybe you could say he became more notorious for painting two works that were extremely controversial at the time. Yeah, I know what you're thinking, like, Manet, controversial? Really? What could be so controversial? Well, these two paintings, these were really got people up in arms when he painted them and put them on display. The one on the left is called Luncheon on the Grass, from 1862, and the one on the right is Olympia from 1863. Now, for someone looking at these in modern times, you might think, well, gee, what's the big deal? These don't really seem all that shocking to me, but you have to kind of remember what people were like or what they were thinking back in this point in time. So let's go back to the 1860s. This one is at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. Luncheon on the Grass. And there it is. And what shocked people was just the fact that there's this nude woman and she's sitting there just very casually with these two guys. And none of them really seem to care that we're looking at them. And then you have this other fourth figure, this woman partially dressed in the background. And they're just kind of hanging out Like this is a normal thing that you would see as you're walking through the parks of Paris. And so nudity was not uncommon in art at this point in time, but there were a lot of rules in place. Like the women had to either be looking very modestly, or that if they were caught nude, they had to be looking very embarrassed. And we don't see either of those things with this woman. So it really shocked a lot of people to see this. And then he came along with this artwork, which was just as shocking, Olympia, from 1863, and kind of a similar thing. She's not looking very modest. She doesn't seem to care that we're looking at her. The other figure over here, she has a really interesting look on her face, and you have the black cat. It's thought that he's depicting a prostitute because she's wearing these shoes in bed. Usually people don't wear shoes in bed, and she has the flower in her hair, and et cetera, et cetera. So again, maybe not all that shocking to people now, but for people of Manet's era, they were really up in arms about these two works. So he got a lot of fame and notoriety from these two paintings, and really kind of got his name out there, so to speak. So these really put him on the public radar, or put him on the map. This one and this one. So I just wanted to know, or have you know, how these works that he's famous for kind of fit into the rest of his career. All right, so Manet spent a lot of time doing still lifes throughout his career. I talked about that earlier. And here are two examples of those. And then he also did a lot of paintings of animals. He was a big animal lover. And here are two early still lifes. Notice kind of the similarity with the other paintings we saw that have this kind of grayish background. And he continues that style, so to speak, with these still lifes. What exactly is a still life painting? It's a popular art subject depicting mostly inanimate subject matter, typically commonplace objects, either natural or man-made, such as flowers, food, plants, drinking glasses, dishes, vases, etc. And here's the first one. This is Oysters, 1862. So he's depicting these natural and man-made items, which is a frequent Manet subject matter. Still lifes. And a close-up. So the man-made items would be the fork and the plate and this dish over here. And then, of course, the natural items would be the oysters and the lemons. And then here's another one, still life with melon and peaches from 1866. It's a really great contrast between the light and dark colors. Now you might be wondering, why would he paint things like this? Well, he was actually selling these. So in the mid 1800s in Paris, France, and Europe, and even in the United States, there's a really growing and expanding middle class. And so a lot of people are decorating their homes with artwork. And so he would sell paintings like this in art galleries to make money. He wouldn't make a fortune, but he'd, bring in some extra money. He's getting some financial support from his family. So he's not entirely dependent on his art sales, but he is selling his work. And so he's not as in dire straits financially as some other artists are during their career, like say Van Gogh. And it's a really beautiful painting. He did a great job of capturing not only the fruits, but also look at this tablecloth. He's got all this details here, and then he's got the varnish of the wood and the keyhole. So all these really kind of interesting little aspects to this painting. And of course, the fruit and the drink. And so imagine going through the art galleries of Paris during this time, the 1860s, and seeing these Manets on display. You could have went and bought one for not all that much money compared to what they're worth now. And then Manet's a big animal lover, so he included animals in several of his works, including these two portraits. Oftentimes in art, when you see an animal, it's accompanying a human. You see them sometimes, but not a lot, portraits of animals by themselves. And so that's what he's done here. So this is a King Charles Spaniel. And so usually these animal portraits were pets that were owned by friends or family members of his. And it's kind of almost looks sort of like a still life, even though it is a dog. And then also too, one of the things, you think about dogs and cats, it's hard to keep them to sit still. And that's what you need for a painting. You have to have the the person or the animal sit still. And so that would have been a challenge for him, but he was able to get that done. He perhaps made a sketch of the dog or two and then made the painting from that, as opposed to having the dog sit there motionless for several hours. And look at the dog's cute face. And then here's another one, Japanese dog from 1873. And again, it's kind of sort of like a still life to a certain degree. Now, one thing you have to wonder is these two dogs, did these dogs have any descendants? Maybe if you have a dog, it might be a descendant of one featured in this Manet painting. Who knows? So again, Manet spends a lot of career on these early still lifes and animals. All right, let's talk about modern Paris life, because this is the thing that Manet is most known for. And I want to include a few portraits of him so you know what he looked like. So many of these artists that are famous, we have no idea what they look like, or at least I know what they look like because I've seen them before, but regular everyday people might not know. Like, for instance, if I was to walk down the street and show this picture to people and ask them who it was, I'm guessing 95 or 99% of the people would have no idea. But if it's Manet, and you can see he's very well dressed. He was known as this stylish man about town. He's got the top hat and the gloves and the walking stick and the pocket watch with the gold chain, and et cetera, et cetera. So he's very dapper. That's kind of one of the things he was known for. And then here's a self-portrait that he did. This is actually in a private collection. You can't see it in a museum usually, but there he is with his palette and paintbrush. And then for our friends in New York City, this is a famous Manet painting. It's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Boating from 1874. So this is around the time when Impressionism gets going, the early 1870s. This is really a classic Manet Impressionist painting from the early days of Impressionism. And then I love this painting. It's at a museum in Belgium, 1879. You have this young couple that are eating outside at a restaurant. And then let's see, if this was a photograph, you'd call this a photo bomber. I guess maybe he's a painting bomber because he's in on the scene as well. And then look at the gaze of this young couple's eyes as they're in love. To me, this looks like a Renoir painting, but it was actually done by Manet. And then for our friends in Baltimore, a great place to visit is the Walters Art Museum. And they have this classic Impressionist painting, The Cafe Concert from 1879. And so I'm showing you these so you can get a sense. This is what Manet's known for, these contemporary, modern, urban life scenes of Paris. And then here's the four works he did from this time frame at the National Gallery of Art. These two paintings here, the one on the bottom left and the center, are really well known. If you had to make a list of, like, I don't know, top 10 or top 20 most famous Manet paintings, these two would definitely be on that list. And then there's these other two over here as well. So let's talk about these four works and modern Paris life and these contemporary urban subjects. Here's our first one. This is Masked Ball at the Opera from 1873. And Manet here is depicting Paris nightlife. And notice he's got that black coloring again. This painting, Manet is actually depicting himself over here on the far right. Now, this is a party that was taking place at the opera. And while the men are very well dressed, these parties were known as not the kind of places that respectable women should be going to. And so the women, many of them, are wearing these masks. They're almost kind of like mocking the fact that they're not supposed to be attending these parties. So on the one hand, they're somewhat obscuring their faces so that they remain unknown. But on the other hand, it's really just a small mask. You can still kind of tell who the people are. But anyway, if you're wondering why the women are wearing masks and the men aren't, it's because this is not the type of party that respectable women of Paris of the day should have attended, because these were just too risque. Now, Manet frequently did these group people scenes throughout his career. So this is a famous painting of his at the National Gallery in London. This is a garden scene in Paris. And so what's going on here? Both of these paintings are really large scale works, and both of them, he's got a lot of figures in them. So look at all these people in this painting in London, and then look at all these people that are in this painting in Washington, DC. And so this is another thing that Manet attempts at different times throughout his career, these large group scenes, so to speak. And again, notice the prevalence of black in both paintings. And here's the work. You have this clown figure here. He's cropped him off. That's interesting. And then you have this woman here. Her bare legs are dangling down. It's thought that perhaps she's trying to get the attention of some of the guys down below, and just all these other things kind of taking place. And there you go, close up. And again, this is Manet himself over here. So it was okay for guys to attend these parties, but it was frowned upon for women. And so you can see the masks here and here and here and over here. And of course, more men than women, judging by the top hats, at least in this scene. And he does add a fair amount of color, so really neat contrast between the whites and the colors of this woman's clothing and the clown figure and this woman's clothing, and then the all black of some of the men and then some of the women. And there you have it. Patty, any thoughts jump out at you on this one?
I put in the chat, the kids these days. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, and I think, because we've had questions about whether he always worked from the brush or whether he sketched first. This is one that brings out, in several of his crowd scenes, he includes himself and several of his friends and contemporaries. So he probably sketched those people and then included their visages in these scenes.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, he wouldn't have been able to show up with a easel and a paintbrush and canvas. Hey, everyone, hold still for a couple hours while I paint all of you. So yeah, great point on that he would have used like sketches to put this together. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but from what I know, just to get onto this lady's question, most of what we've seen, excuse me, most of what we've seen so far is direct paint, right? Direct brushwork.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
I don't think in these paintings he used a lot of sketch work at all.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I love this thing with the black, because as I said, we often get that question or that point with whites, but this is the first time I remember people really jumping on that issue with the black, the ways in which he gives it life and depth.
Oh yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, look at the contrast here, the different shading and how he's able to get that effect. And he would have had to mix the black paint with different things to get that visual effect. So no, I really appreciate people mentioning that. It's a great point.
Yeah, if I tried to do that, it would be one-dimensional.
Oh yeah, me too. It'd be abstract if I did it. So here's another painting of his that's well known for our friends in the Midwest, Art Institute Chicago. This was a horse race. So horse races became very popular in the mid 1800s in Europe and America, because again, people have more disposable income, they have more leisure time, and so they're doing things like the National Gallery Art. It's thought that this one was done around 1875, and it's another kind of modern Paris life scene, people going to the racetrack. And then this one has an interesting perspective, because this is a horse race and the horses are coming directly at him. There's no way that he would have been able to paint this on site while the horse race was taking place. So he probably, like Patty just said, he probably made preliminary works into this one. But if you compare the two, notice the one in Chicago is earlier, 1866. And then it's thought that there's kind of two schools of thought on the one on the right, that's the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. One is that perhaps he worked on this one around the same time and then revisited it later, or it's another possibility is he just did it later. But usually what you see in paintings that the same artist does, if it's not a study or like a prep work, usually the later painting is more simplified. So like, for instance, notice in this one, he doesn't have all the crowds of people. That would have been a lot of work to include all that in here. And then also in this one, notice there's 5 figures, and on this one, or sorry, on this one there's 6, and in this one there's 5. So there's one fewer figure, which makes it more kind of the figures themselves stand out. And so here's that painting. And again, notice it's much more
the second
sketchy.
one is more immediate as well.
What then?
I'm sorry, the second one is more immediate as well. There's a sense of immediacy.
Oh yeah, it's really coming on you. It looks like this one, you have a little bit of time to get out of the way before the horses stampede you. But this one, yeah. They're going to be there any second. So yeah, that's a great point as well.
And again, you see more of what we think of as impressionist technique in that second one.
Yeah, definitely. That's also a great point. Notice how this one over here, it's much more detailed, and this one's much more kind of like sketchy, so to speak. Not sketchy like Bad Neighborhood sketchy, but sketchy like how it was put together composition-wise.
Which is kind of the feature of Impressionism, right? It does give one a sense of life and immediacy. Yeah,
definitely. So anyway, if you were, like I said, I like to look at the paintings side by side or in groups, just so you kind of get a sense of what the artist was trying to accomplish over different periods of time. And one of the things that Impressionism is known for is landscape paintings. And at the National Gallery of Art, they have 2 classic examples, the one on the left by Monet and the one on the right by Van Gogh. And these were called paintings in plein air, meaning they were painted outdoors. And so a lot of Impressionists, Monet, Van Gogh, Renoir, et cetera, paint these landscape works outside, but not Manet. That he did do the horse racing ones outside, but this just was not his thing. So you're not going to see these great Manet landscape paintings like you will with Monet and Van Gogh. And if you go visit the National Gallery of Art in DC, you can check these out at the same time you're visiting the Manet paintings. So you have water lilies, and then the scene from the south of France by Van Gogh. And I think for a lot of people, when they look at these 2 works, even if you haven't seen this painting before, you might be able to guess like, oh, okay, that looks like a Monet. Oh, okay, yeah, that looks like a Van Gogh, even if you haven't seen specific paintings for. Whereas Manet's paintings can be a little bit trickier to kind of guess if they're works by him or someone else. But let's talk about this modern life aspect of Manet's works. And these are 2 of his most famous paintings, and they're both at the National Gallery of Art in DC. So let's talk about these. I was actually going to take a break as we go through this section and ask all of you what you see when you look at these 2 paintings. So you can be on the lookout for that opportunity. All right, this first one is called The Railway from 1873. And this is an iconic Impressionist painting. Again, Impressionism gets going in the early 1870s, about 10 years after Manet started his career. Notice by this point in time, he's 41 years old. So he's already an established artist. And this is really a great depiction of color and light. And here you go. This is also one of the most popular artworks in the National Gallery of Art, just in general. And I really like this painting. Artists are trained and taught and familiar with how to use different visual like tricks and techniques to kind of get our attention or to hold our attention. So look at this painting and all the different contrasts that are taking place. So on the one hand, you have this seated woman. On the other hand, you have this standing young girl. And notice that her clothing is blue with white accents. Oops. And hers is, she's blue with white accents. She's white with blue accent. Her hair is let down. Her hair is up with this ribbon. She has a hat. She's facing us. She's facing away. She's standing with her arms on the rails. She's holding a, remember the dog portraits we saw earlier in a book. So really a lot of great, interesting contrast here. And then also too, you have the lines here of the railway. So these are 2 women that are, or a girl and a young woman, they're at our train station. This is a famous train station in Paris. And there's another one of these National Gallery of Art's educational videos for children that I thought I would queue up. So let's see what they have to say about this work.
s'abord. Le train va partir dans 5 minutes. All aboard.
A young girl and woman have stopped near an iron fence. What might have caught the young girl's attention? The billowing white clouds of smoke, steam rising from the train station below. The haze hides the tracks of the famous Gare Saint-Lazare, the biggest and busiest train station in Paris at this time. On the top left, do you see the brown doors of a building? That's the entrance to the studio of Édouard Manet, the artist who painted this picture. He has set this painting in his own neighborhood, and here he's captured the everyday activities of a big city. Let's look closely at how Manet painted the girl and woman. The woman wears a long, deep blue dress trimmed with white, while the girl wears a short, white dress trimmed with a big blue bow. Manet has painted them as opposites. Let's look for some other opposites. How about their hairstyles? The woman's is down, fanning over her shoulders. The girl's hair is tied up. The girl's hair is tied in a thin black ribbon. The woman has a similar ribbon around her neck. The woman is seated. The girl is standing. The woman is looking at us, while the girl looks away. Did you notice that the woman has a fan, a book, and a sleeping puppy on her lap? Perhaps she and the girl were reading together before the train came along. What do you think they will do next? Maybe snack on some grapes? Did you spot them? Manet was interested in capturing modern Paris. Trains were popular subjects because the railroad was a new phenomenon in France in the 19th century. With advances in train technology, people could easily travel from the city to the seaside or the countryside for day trips or vacations. Manet didn't paint the trains, but instead indicates their presence by the cloud of steam. You can still visit the Gare Saint-Lazare today. It's one of the busiest rail stations in France, handling more than 400,000 passengers each day.
All right, so thanks for our friends at the National Gallery of Art for putting that video together. So we talked about how Manet bridges traditional or pre-impressionism painting with impressionism. So remember, we saw this work earlier, and notice it's very dark, and contrast that with this painting we're looking at now, which is very light and bright and airy. So one of the key characteristics of Manet's career, bridges traditional art with impressionism. And I like the fact that they point out the grapes because those are so easy to miss. And also, too, they talked about the fact this is a train station. Someone mentioned in the comments they didn't see the train, and that's on purpose. Manet doesn't want you to focus on the train. He wants you to focus on the people instead. And the reason why trains are frequently featured in Impressionist paintings is because they were becoming very popular. So this map of the 1850s is showing you rail lines that existed in France at this point in time. Now, fast forward 20 years and notice how many more rail lines there are. So there was a real explosion in the use of trains. And so again, the Impressionists, particularly Manet, they're capturing what's going on in the world around them. And because trains are becoming much more popular, they're frequently featured in Impressionist artworks. You might recall Monet did a whole series on trains as well. And as they mentioned in the video, this train station is still in existence. It's one of the key train stops that you can go to, or train stations that you can use if you're in Paris, the Gare Saint-Lazare. It's a sign right here. And then here's a vintage print of it from, quote unquote, back in the day. Beautiful architecture. And then here's another vintage postcard. Now look at over here, notice this iron railing. So this is not where the painting was done, but it does give you a sense of that's the architectural feature of this site, which makes its appearance in Manet's painting. Notice the iron work here the fencing. And so this little spot here, you could sit down and wait for their guests to arrive. Now, this woman, Victorine, she's not well known to like the average person or average art connoisseur, but she's somewhat famous in art circles because she was the lead figure in these other two famous paintings by Manet. So this figure here and this figure here is the same woman that's pictured here. And it's kind of unusual, or I think it's interesting or fascinating how a lot of these people that are depicted in these famous paintings, we don't really know who they are. We know who the artists are, but we don't know who they are. So interesting, I wanted to point out the fact that she's featured in these three famous Manet paintings, and she was his favorite model. And there's a picture of her in real life. And again, I really like the contrast of the woman seated versus the standing young girl, and one's facing us, the other's facing away. The blue clothing with the white accents on the left, with the white clothing and the blue accents on the right, et cetera, et cetera. The hair differences, the hat versus the ribbon, the little dog. You can see the steam or the smoke from the trains. So really great painting with a lot of cool details. Oh, someone brought up a good point. Lisa, I wondered for some time about the dress. Woman on the left seems dressed for colder weather, girl on the right for summer day. Yeah, that's we talked about that a little bit in the previous program, the fact that their clothing is a little bit different.
Robert, didn't Victorine go on to become an artist herself?
I don't remember what her story was, to be honest with you. Sorry, I've been studying so many different things. Another
Yeah,
kind of, I don't remember that detail.
I'm not positive, but I think I remember reading that.
And then again, notice the grapes over here at the right. Interesting touch to include those. So when you look at this painting, the railway from 1873, what stands out to you? What do you see? What do you notice? What do you think about this work? Patty, we'll start with you. When take a look at this one, what jumps out at your attention?
Well, this particular time, I mean, I was struck by the difference between the weight of adulthood versus the lightness of youth. That would be like a summation of it. And let's see, Shulamit is saying that in the train station, you can see that the white dress actually has very little actual white, which again, that's what I mean. Most often that comment about the use of so many different shades to create colors in Impressionism comes up most often with the white. But if you look at Victorine's hat, you can see that's like a horsehair type hat, and he conveys the ripples beautifully with the various black shades and coloration. But yeah.
Notice he does include the black in there a little bit with the hat.
That's what I mean. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So he does seem to be pretty fascinated by that particular contrast. Those would be extremes, right? White versus black. And then he explores it somewhat in between. I mean, that bow in the back of the dress is just amazing in terms of the conveyance of print and fabric. And actually somebody did just confirm that Victorine did actually become an artist herself.
I got a text message from my friend Jennifer, who's watching. Thanks, Jennifer. She said, yes, she was a somewhat well-known artist. She gets a little overshadowed by Manet. So thank you. Okay, sorry, Patty.
No, those are the two things that jump out. And again, as you mentioned, there are reasons why people at the time would have immediately recognized this as a train station because of the features you pointed out, that trains were a development of the time. But that's also a feature of Impressionism, is that they're not particularly literal. So it invites the viewer to engage with imagination almost instantly, which is a huge departure from what we think of as realist painting, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, no, definitely. Let's see, what does the audience folks have to say?
Yeah, we're getting, let's see. Lilith,
It'd be realistic if the older woman was holding a sweater or jacket for the child. That's a very observant thing to notice. Yeah, I like that.
But again, that's part of what I mean about the temptation we often have to be literal, as opposed to that the amount of suggestion that you can fit into any given impressionist painting. I don't know if I'm making a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. Oh, another comment about the dog. Yeah, more dogs than cats. But you see cats in paintings. There was a famous Renoir painting at the National Gallery of Art that has a cat in it.
Yeah, and also too, remember he's painting contemporary life, which was a rise of a larger bourgeois class. So owning non-working animals as pets was a thing. It always becomes a thing among people who are more well off and not, food and shelter insecure. So that's a signifier of what else is going on. Yeah, I like these comments about people noticing the weather suggestions of the dress, because that's what I mean. I more take it as less about the specific weather of that day, but about you would expect women of Victorine's age, or the age she's portraying, as being much more covered up in much more somber colors to denote I think she's appearing to be a governess. So it would denote or connote her particular relationship. But that's, again, I see the care. Yes, Michelle's saying the carefree spirit. That's what I mean, the lightness of youth as opposed to or childhood. And again, it's hard to remember, but that is a feature of bourgeois life too. The less well off you are, the more likely you are to be working in a factory, because this is also the development of an industrial age, right?
Oh, yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, like Lilith pointed out, the woman is so warmly dressed and the girl so lightly dressed. Interesting. Kimberly says, in regards to the attire at the time in Paris, would women be more covered up in formal dress than children? So it may be a warm day, but the adult woman had to dress more formally. That's a good point.
Yeah, exactly. The carefree nature of childhood, as opposed to, well, she's an adult, she has clear responsibilities, not necessarily limited to this child, but she's definitely denoted and connoted as the responsible party here.
Yeah, in the other program we did on this, people were asking like, oh, maybe they're at the train station because the young girl's waiting for her dad to show up, or her parents or something. And is this her mom or an older sister or a nanny, or all kinds of different possibilities in there as well.
But the station in life is truly different. And again, like I say, remember at the time that this child would immediately have been recognized as somebody who had leisure, a family of sufficient wealth to afford this kind of clothing and leisure time. So yeah, there's things we lose by not being right there at that moment, but the more you look at it, I think the more this jumps out.
Oh yeah, and also reading a book. This is the era when women weren't as appreciated for their intellect, so interesting to include that little aspect. And then I don't know, what do you think about the grapes? What's the story with that, you think?
Yeah, I did not see the grapes the first few times I looked at this painting until it was pointed out in that video. Amazing. Yeah, Kavita is also saying absolutely about the class difference, which would have meant something entirely different at the time than it would to us now.
Oh yeah, very different. And yeah, I like
Whoops, I lost your voice, Robert.
Aspects of it or nuances and things like that. So really cool. And let's see if there's any other comments that jumped out. Oh, here's Anonymous says, the woman appears disengaged from the girl. Yeah, I guess that is one thing to think, like, what is their connection? Are they relatives or close? Yeah, they are. I mean, they're in close proximity, but they're not essentially interacting with one another.
But that's fairly typical of Manet's women, right? They're mostly looking directly out at the painter or the viewer.
Yeah, if you go back to those other two works we saw.
They're very matter-of-factly engaged.
Yeah, here and here. Very similar type of setup.
Yeah, and again, you don't know. Is it that simply the way he related to women? I don't know the answer to that, but
Yeah, because like look at the photograph. I mean, it's not by Manet, but she's looking off to the side, and that's just one image, but it is interesting the contrast between that she's looking directly at us here, and then here she's looking off to the side.
yeah, I mean, let's see what else has come in.
Well, we can continue on. Let's why don't we continue on, because we have quite a bit of more art to look at. So anyway, that is the railway. Now here's another famous painting that I thought we'd stop and chat a little bit about because it's so famous. This is Plum Brandy from 1877. This is also a very iconic impressionist painting depicting modern Paris life. So you have this woman, young woman, seated here in a cafe. What's that, Patty?
The slide hasn't changed on my screen. I know.
Oh, sorry. Let me tweak that. Thank you. All right, there we go. Sorry about that. So this is Plum Brandy, 1877. It's an iconic impressionist painting. It's Manet depicting modern Paris life again. So you have this young woman seated here in a cafe as she's contemplating the future, perhaps. And there's this plum brandy refers to the drink that's here in front of her, and she's smoking a cigarette, which would have been a big no-no for polite women to do back at that point in time. And here is the woman who posed for the painting. She ended up becoming a famous actress later in life. At this point in time, she was just getting started in her career. She was a model and actress, but later on, she would become one of the most famous actresses in France. So interesting footnote on her story. And then this was depicting a cafe in Paris that was really well known. So a lot of the Impressionists do these depictions of restaurants and bars and cafes and the Folie Bergère and all that kind of stuff. So this is the one that Manet was referencing in his painting. And here she is. And so what is she doing, or what is she thinking about? A lot of different directions you can go with this one. And before we talk about that, though, what exactly is Impressionism? Well, if you compare a single solitary figure in the history of, say, French paintings, you can see quite a few differences. So this is the artist Vigée Lebrun. We previously talked about her. This is a painting from 1782. And this is Napoleon by David from 1812. This is Ingres from 1851. And Manet in 1877. So what is Impressionism? Well, let's take a look at these other works. And sometimes with Impressionism, it's easier to see what it is by comparing it to something that came beforehand. So this is a beautiful painting that you can also see. Oops, I forgot to mention all these paintings are at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. So they have a really incredible encyclopedic art collection. But anyway, this is Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun, great French artist. This is her painting, Madame du Barry from 1782. So this is 95 years before Plum Brandy. And it's a different artist, of course. And okay, look at those differences. Notice how this one is much less formal. This one is much more formal. She was very wealthy. She was one of the most wealthy, prominent, important women in all of France. This is just a regular everyday person sitting in a cafe. And then here's Napoleon by David. This is also at the National Gallery of Art in DC. It's one of the most famous works in their collection. This is 65. And so again, Napoleon, most important person in Europe at this point in time. And compare and contrast that with this regular everyday woman sitting in a cafe. It's not photographic like in that time. And then this is from 1851. So we're getting closer to Manet's time frame. And look at those two side by side. Again, a very well-dressed woman, very wealthy and prominent. It's very detailed, almost photographic-like, and done a couple decades before this painting. And so again, what is Impressionism? Well, you kind of tell just by looking at these two and kind of comparing and contrasting them. And close-ups. Oh, Marilyn said the shape of the dish is more like ice cream than brandy. That's true, Marilyn, but that's how they used to drink this particular beverage back then. So this is a glass of brandy that has a plum in it. It's kind of a thing back in the day. But anyway, notice how the kind of style changes of these works. And again, notice how formal all of these are, how very detailed all of them are. These are very important, prominent, wealthy people, the regular everyday person like me and you just sitting in a cafe. Notice none of them are smoking cigarettes or drinking alcohol also. And these ones, they're all looking directly at us. She's actually looking off to the side, which is a little bit different from Manet in some of his works. And so there you go, Édouard Manet, painter of modern life. Now, interestingly enough, it would have been say, controversial for a woman to sit in a cafe by herself at this point in time. This is still the era where women would have needed chaperones to go out in public by themselves to places like cafes. Women could go shopping by themselves and run errands. To go for a woman just to go by herself to plop down in a cafe and order a plum brandy and smoke a cigarette would have been very shocking for kind of the high society type folks. And she's looking off into the distance. What is she thinking about or contemplating? We don't know. And he's got a really interesting positioning of her hand. Notice the fold of her hand, and then her face up against her hand. And notice how the hat is different than the painting we saw earlier. And then there is that plum brandy. Women smoked during this time, not as much as men did, but when they did so, they would do it indoors, not in public. And so the fact that she's has a cigarette here, and it looks like her cigarette is unlit. So perhaps she's waiting for a young gentleman to come by and offer to light her cigarette. Perhaps. And then there's another kind of similar painting by Degas. It's at a different museum. It's at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. This also is a very famous Impressionist painting. And so look at this one and compare it to Plum Brandy in just a minute. And then this is one by Manet. It's a different figure. This one's much more kind of cheery. This is a woman reading outside in a cafe. And then we did our Edward Hopper program last year. We talked about this painting, and a lot of people were wondering, like, what is this woman doing? Is she sad? Is she just contemplating? Is it good or bad or indifferent? The fact that she's in this cafe by herself, kind of, et cetera, et cetera. So there's the Manet compared to the Degas. And it's thought that Manet perhaps was influenced by Degas' painting, because this became a very famous work by Degas, and Manet was familiar with Degas and his work. And then this one is a Manet from 1877. This one is from 1880, 1881. You can see, notice how these two are kind of similar. They both feature women. This one, to me, just looks a little more cheery. It's kind of more of a spring atmosphere. The woman's not maybe as contemplative as the one on the left, et cetera, et cetera. And then Hopper, Edward Hopper, he traveled to Paris on a number of occasions, and he was greatly influenced by the Impressionists, including Degas and Manet. And some people have wondered if this painting was kind of his modern interpretation. And there you have it. So Plum Brandy from 1877. So when you look at this painting, what do you see and what do you think? And Patty, we'll start with you. What jumps out for you on this one?
Yeah, again, several people have mentioned the Hopper painting. And yeah, it is pretty amazing how frequently people interpret paintings of single women in a social setting as being kind of forlorn or abandoned somehow, or in the depths of sadness. So yeah, again, I see, because it does not look like that cigarette is lit. and she does not look to have imbibed much from her glass. I see someone possibly waiting for an engagement. And so she's not smoking, she's just holding onto the cigarette, and she can, she can put it away at any moment. But then again, there's a lot of projection always. And, the thing I love most about Impressionism, there's so many things to love, but the way in which it invites people to bring their own experience and their own life to their vision of the painting. And you can't really say that about traditional realism, I don't think. One of the points someone else has brought up, or several others have brought up, is that very few of his figures are smiling, or none of them actually. But again, that was fairly common, and that seems to have followed through from realism to Impressionism. So there's a couple of things. It could be just the custom, the way of portraying people. It could be a fascination with looking at people in their natural state. But also you have to consider that modern dentistry was still kind of on the horizon at this point.
Oh, yeah. And people are just much more formal. Like even in photography, you don't really see people smiling left and move.
Yeah, it's much more solemn.
But I think even if they could move, they would have been just more acting that way. So here was an interesting point from Elaine. She says, notice, hold on. I'll have to come back to Elaine's thought because I need to look at the painting. She says, Elaine says, notice details in the tabletop with gal in pink and the details in her outfit. Yeah, so really interesting kind of connection between the tabletop and the coloring of it and her clothing. So thanks, Elaine, appreciate that. And then Sushma says that, what was that shade of pink clothing prevalent at the time? That's a good question. I'm not sure about that. That would be fascinating to know. Is that something that would have been common for women to wear that shade of clothing or not? I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that, Sushma, but thank you. That's very interesting to consider.
Yeah, I don't necessarily know in terms of the color, but you have to consider life was very grimy still at this time. So if you could afford to wear bright colors or light colors, that meant you didn't have a lot of care about taking care of your laundry and that sort of thing.
Yeah, someone would be taking care of it for you, and it's not big, grimy, great word to think about. But in the end, again, just the differences between, like, say, this painting and then the one that we're looking at now. So yeah, that's kind of a very class distinction. Like obviously there's going to be a lot of work. Now this is from a different era. There's going to be a lot of work involved in wearing something like this versus wearing this kind of more regular everyday clothing. Let's see. Karen says she thinks all pink was not common, especially that light of a color. So that's good to know. Thanks, Karen. Appreciate that. And then, yeah, people commenting on the fact that, is it a bad thing that a woman is in a cafe by herself? Like, if this was a guy and he was sitting there in front of a drink and with this unlit cigarette in his hand, we probably wouldn't think, oh, is that poor guy lonely? Was he stood up? Is there something wrong with him? Is he sad? It's kind of interesting how, we interpret things differently depending on maybe our own gender or the gender of the people being depicted in the artwork.
And that is, again, there's that classic, the things we don't think of about ourselves. So that's one reason why these programs and these discussions are, it exposes us to other people's interpretation of that. I always tend to be kind of surprised that so many people think lonely or forlorn or abandoned. One person in the Q&A had also said the same thing. So a lot of it has to do with one's own orientation toward life. Or the closer you look at this, she does not really look sad. She looks lost in thought.
Yeah, when you zoom in close up, that's what's great about art. If you're ever visiting an art museum and you're looking at a painting, it's good to look at it from like 10, 15, 20 feet away, but then also look at it close up like a foot or two away, because you'll notice things differently depending on your perspective. And so Patty, that's really a great example that, when you look at it, zoom in on it, her facial expression maybe looks a little bit different than if you are looking at it from further away.
And there's definite light in her eyes that you don't notice until you look at it close up, which again does not suggest forlorn to me. It suggests that she's interested in what she's thinking about.
Karen says she studied fabric and fashions throughout the centuries, and pink was not common, especially that light of a pink. So thanks, Karen. Appreciate that. And then Elaine says, notice no jewelry on her, no bracelet, necklace, or rings. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, what does that mean? Maybe it doesn't mean anything, or maybe it does mean something. I don't know. What do you think, Patty? The fact that she doesn't have any jewelry on that we can see. What is that?
Well, it gives me the sense that this is a daytime setting, as opposed to, because I don't think it was that customary at that time to be draped in jewelry, even if one could afford it. But again, the fact that this is a rare color for the time would indicate somebody of means. So less a prostitute, as some people like to often suggest, and more, somebody who has some leisure and discretion in her life. But and I may be wrong, but I don't think a lot of much jewelry was particularly common. You do see, some pretty rich detail in the cuffs, which indicates, again, social or financial status. But somebody else can correct me, but I don't think heavy duty jewelry during the daytime was common.
Well, do we know it's during the daytime though? Maybe it's not during.
Well, that's why it implies daytime to me. That's where I get.
Oh, I see. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Okay.
No, your voice is fading out occasionally, Robert.
Oh, sorry about that.
No, I thought it might be just me, but somebody else had mentioned it as well. Yeah, Karen is saying jewelry was for evening wear.
Okay. Well,
that was what I thought. Yeah. Notice these two. I had pointed out before about the absinthe having the unsavory reputation. It wasn't just alcohol, it was the absinthe itself and the material that was used to make it. But see how these two characters look pretty unsavory? And this,
exactly.
Isn't that in the title, Absinthe Drinkers?
Yep. Exactly.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know, because you can still buy what is called absinthe now, but it's completely different from what these people would have been drinking at the time.
Oh yeah.
And this
what about the compare and contrast between these two paintings, which are not really all that far apart time frame wise, and they're both pretty much the same thing. A woman sitting in like a cafe, although one's indoors and one's outdoors. To me, this one looks
that was part of that bourgeois development of society, right? That was a more common thing. People who had, again, when we look at the type of dress, it's easy to immediately jump to, prostitute, but I don't know that suggests that to me. It really suggests more the time.
Yeah, we had such a funny discussion about this one during the Hopper program. All these, like you brought up a good point where people kind of tend to project their own kind of thoughts and opinions and perspectives on the art. Like artwork is in some ways like a mirror. Like you're seeing, yourself in these works and your, beliefs and biases and things like that. So
Nikki just said maybe this is her third plum brandy. Good point. That might light up the eyes a bit. And anonymous.
Well, also the other time someone said the painting on the left is me when I'm on a break from my boring job or something like that. Something like that.
Yeah. And anonymous is saying the tailoring is very careful and specific. Exactly. The soutache, the collar and frilly cravat, the bow at her knees, the pleating at the cuffs. It does suggest more wealth to me. And like I say, daytime as well. It's fancy dress. It's upper class dress, but it's not evening dress. So.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, that's excellent. All right. Well, let's continue on. So we got a little bit more art to cover. So again, Manet, known for these depictions of modern Paris life, these contemporary urban subjects. And these are 4 great examples you can see at the National Gallery of Art. All right, let's continue on. Let's talk about some portraits that Manet did. And Manet, as I mentioned at the beginning of the program, he was older and more established than the other artists that are known as Impressionists. And this is a painting of Manet in his studio. And he's mentoring Renoir and Basile and Monet here. And so that was something that he did. He doesn't really get a lot of credit for that. But that was something that was important. And then we talk about what is Impressionism again. Let's look at these 2 portraits. This one is of a lady from 1879. And when we talk about modern Paris life, well, fashion plays an important part of history and culture. We unfortunately don't know the identity of this woman. Notice she's in profile, which is different than some of the other works we've seen. And it's very impressionist looking here just because it's not as detailed as some of the earlier works we saw. You can see the brush strokes in it. And then for our friends in New York City, you might recognize this famous Manet painting of his friend, the writer, author, George Moore, 1879. So this is not at the National Gallery of Art. It's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. But there's a similar painting of the same subject, his friend, George Moore, also from 1879 at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. This is what's called a loose painterly style. What it means by that is when you can actually see the brush strokes, that's the painterly style. Loose means it's not as kind of tightly composed where you can see all the details. Like look at his face. He put that together pretty quickly. And so this is National Gallery of Art, George Moore portrait on the left, Metropolitan Museum of Art portrait on the right. And then this time frame, they had photography. So why would people still have their portrait done painted when you could just have a photograph done? So this is not the same person, of course. This is not George Moore. It's Mark Twain. And you can see there's quite a few differences between painting and photography from this era. So if you were to look at these two portraits to kind of compare and contrast them, notice how the painters like Manet, they have a little bit more freedom or more flexibility to do things differently. And of course, also at this point in time, they don't have color photography, but really great contrast and comparison between the portraits of two famous writers, George Moore as a painted portrait on the left, and Mark Twain as a photographic portrait on the right. And so what exactly is Impressionism? Well, there's a lot of different things that cover Impressionism, but for this particular painting, some things that kind of stand out make it. Impressionism, number one, is the contemporary subject. So he's a well-known writer and author of this time in Paris, as opposed to like, say, a history painting of like a famous battle or something like that. The light, bright colors, the abstraction. Notice his face is starting to go very abstract versus like the photographic quality of some of the things we saw earlier. And this painterly style where you can actually see the brushworks, these visible brushworks. In artwork earlier, they would have smoothed that out so you couldn't actually see the brushwork. So there's some quick examples in that one.
What's interesting about this one too, Robert, is the number of people for whom this one leaves the impression of it being unfinished. And I'm not exactly sure why, but I have had that impression sometimes as well. It clearly, when you sit and look at it, yes, it looks complete. And yet when you're not looking at it, there's this sense that it's not quite hardened somehow. I don't know. I don't know how to say it, but I found that other people remember this painting that way as well.
Okay, yeah. And we'll notice he's sitting here. So is he lonely? Is he a prostitute? I don't know. We don't know. No, I'm just kidding. He's not, of course, because we know who this is. But again, that kind of distinction between how we judge or kind of form opinions of the image of a woman versus a man. And, that would hold true if we're looking at modern images, like in a magazine or on a website, or if we see someone in public. So interesting in that regard. And again, Manet is friends with a lot of people that are artists and writers and musicians and actors and politicians and that kind of stuff. So it kind of makes sense that he'd be friends with George Moore. All right, let's talk about Manet's later years. This is one of his most famous paintings. That's the Courtauld Gallery in London. And this is the bar at the Folies Bergère. It's really kind of the last of the big, great, impressive paintings that Manet did. You can see he passed away in 1883. And this work was done in 1881, 1882. It's an iconic artwork. And there it is. And notice, remember we talked earlier about those group scenes. And you don't really see those oftentimes in outside of an artist's early career because it takes a lot of work to put all these little details together. But I think maybe perhaps because Manet at this point in time, his health was really deteriorating. He probably had some indication he wasn't going to be living that much longer. This is almost kind of like his one last big, giant, detailed, busy painting that he's going to do. So really interesting work there. So just wanted again to include some of these other Manet things to kind of see how they fit into the context of his life and career. And then here's 4 works that he did at the National Gallery of Art in his later years. He went back to the still life theme. Remember, we saw him doing still lifes earlier in his career. So this is 1880. His health was really he was having a number of health issues later in life, but he continued to paint. And many times you don't really think of still life as maybe as fascinating of an art form as landscape paintings or portrait, but you think like Van Gogh. He made his still lifes of sunflower paintings. A lot of other artists have done still lifes throughout their careers. Here's some pears. Did from 1880. Got the marble tabletop. And then this woman was a friend of his, and she was married to an artist who also was a friend of Manet's. And this is a pastel painting. The other works that we've seen have all been oil paintings. This one is actually a pastel, and it's really beautifully done. Look at her fancy clothing that she's wearing. Manet would oftentimes invite women to his studio, and he would tell them to dress up their finest attire for their portraits. So that's perhaps what's happened here. And then again, we talked about how it's really hard to kind of categorize Manet's works because notice how different all 4 of these portraits are. We saw these 3 earlier, and then now we're talking about this one on the right. And there's not a huge, 1866 to 1882, yeah, it's kind of a fair amount of time, but it's not really all that long in kind of like the grand scheme of things. That you notice just how very different all of these are. Patty, anything pop out for you when you look at the 4 of these kind of compared side by side?
Well, I love that particularly with Manet, you can really trace the development from where he began his career and his training to what he was able to do with his talent. And it really, you can really understand how he became kind of a focal point of interest for many of his contemporaries.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Elaine points out, where to go, the comment was, style of dress and the woman on the right is like a barmaid showing small waistline. Yeah, we'll talk about the waistline in just a minute. It's very narrow. And before we get to that though, so Manet did this whole series of pastel portraits in the late 1870s and early 1880s. And I really like these works a lot. And for whatever reason, these aren't as well known as some of his other works that he did, like the genre scenes or the modern Paris life. But I really like these pastels a lot. So let's take a look at these real briefly again, just so you can kind of see how the National Gallery Art Collection fits in with his overall career. So this one is at the Art Institute of Chicago. This was a friend of his who was a fellow artist. This one's at a great museum, the St. Louis Art Museum in Missouri. This is at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. And then, of course, this one's at the National Gallery of Art in DC. And I don't know, these are pastels are just really cool. I really like these a lot. And some other artists did pastels as well, most notably Degas. But for Manet, he did a whole series of portraits. So imagine him inviting women to get all dressed up and come down to his studio and do portraits of them. And these were, for the most part, friends of his. By this point in time, Manet's set financially. He's not really doing like paid commission portraits. He's kind of just doing it more for kicks. He was selling artwork sufficiently enough to support himself, so that's not a factor in his life. And again, really like these pastel portraits a lot. So I wanted to make sure you were familiar with these. And again, if you were to see one of these works at a museum and see it's a pastel, like, oh, okay, he did a pastel. Well, no, he actually did a whole series of them. So that's why it sometimes helped to kind of look and see what an artist was doing, kind of in more of like a broader context, so you can understand what they were trying to accomplish. And then this is a idea I got from Patty. We were talking about the clothes that women would wear and their portraits, and the whole differences that come there. So this is actually Lucretia Garfield. She was the first lady of the United States. Her husband was James Garfield. And the women are different because this woman on the left is a little bit younger and she's French. The woman on the right, Lucretia Garfield, a little bit older and she's American. And it's a painted portrait or pastel portrait versus a photograph. But again, that being said, really a lot of interesting comparisons and contrasts between these two. And notice all the details of the clothing and how the photograph captures the woman quite a bit differently than the pastel does, and then they're able to include all the color, et cetera, et cetera. So really kind of interesting comparison and contrast there. So thanks, Patty, for the first lady suggestion.
Well, and two, just to make a point, notice that this, I don't know for other people, but if you look at the earrings, the necklace, and the style and color of the dress, to me, and the hairstyle, to me, that suggests that this is an evening. She's dressed for evening.
Yeah, she's dressed, that's a good point. Let me go back and
not only look at the décolletage, I mean.
Hold on, and I'll pull up the other portrait that we were looking at. Just a moment. All right, so here's the earlier one we saw, just to refresh your memory. And then we'll fast forward and hold on, takes a second to get there. And look at this one. So yeah, a little bit different there. But again, he's also inviting, for all we know, the woman in the earlier painting might have just gotten off of work or something, where he's actually inviting people to come to the studio, particularly women. Manet more often did paintings of women than men. Hey, get dressed up in your nicest clothes and come down to the studio, and I'll do your portrait kind of thing. So
Elaine also mentioned the gloves. The décolletage and the gloves are dead giveaways.
Oh yeah, great point, Elaine. Thank you. Yeah, the gloves. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because notice Lucretia Garfield, which she's also very well dressed, but she's not wearing gloves.
She's holding the hanky. See the hanky and the again, those are iconic images that it's hard for us to necessarily relate to because of they're historical. They're not contemporary.
Yeah, you can learn a lot though by looking. It's something that I've had to acquire over the years. I'm a big picture person. I don't really focus in sometimes on details. So for me, but you can really learn a lot from these works and the people that made them or the people that they're depicting by looking at the details. So like you said, the handkerchief and the gloves and the jewelry and the clothing and the pose and all that stuff.
Oh, Elaine also points out that the Lucretia Garfield's dress, it looks more like a morning dress. I don't actually know because remember her husband died.
I don't remember that's a good point. I don't remember the date on this photograph, so that's possible. I'm not sure. Her husband was not president for very long before he was assassinated. So yeah, that's a good point. I should look into that for next time. Just FYI, so Manet did a preliminary sketch work. We were talking about this earlier. Did he always just paint the works themselves directly? No, sometimes he would do preliminary works. You can see this one here. And the reason why artists do this is they can put something like this together pretty quickly. And so it kind of relieves the person of having to pose for an extended period of time. And so sometimes it makes it a little bit easier.
The headband on the one on the left looks more like a crown in the sketch as opposed to, I think it ended up as more of a ribbon. Interesting.
Yeah, and in both today and the last time we did, the people point out, wow, look at her waist. It's really narrow.
Yeah, another thing we forget about is corsets. They were very structured at the time.
Yeah, I'd like to wear that.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, that was one reason why they had fainting couches, because these ladies oftentimes could not breathe.
Yeah, well, and then the really pretty low cut neck. It's not scandalously so, but
décolletage they call that, and definitely, yeah, that is definitely evening.
Yeah, and she's not going to wear that to the office. And then the beautiful necklace, and also too, artists make decisions. So why is she kind of looking off the side versus some of those other ones where the woman was looking directly at us? So artists make these choices and decisions as they're putting their works together.
Yeah, this one's more romantic.
Mm.
You know, I don't know the relationship of the woman to Monet, but there's like a more of a
She and her husband were both friends of his, and so he did a portrait, I think, of the two of them together on another occasion. So yeah, he was friends with her, but he was also friends with her husband.
I mean romantic in the style, in the romance style, as
Oh
opposed
yeah,
to,
yeah,
yeah, you know what I mean? I don't know
yeah.
a better
Not
word
much.
for it.
And there's the thin weight. And then notice too, look at all the really beautiful details he captured of her dress with the flowers and the pattern.
Amazing, yeah, amazing embroidery.
Yeah. Beautiful necklace, earrings.
And yeah, somebody else had made the point that the crimped ruffle in Lucretia Garfield's was much more rigid, as opposed to this being a very soft, inviting Irish lace.
What I wonder is, now that we're in like the Instagram selfie age, if we'll be, 150 years from now, wow, look at how she took this selfie of herself, and it's a lot different than this other selfie. Blah, blah, blah. So we'll have to see what people 150 years from now are looking at.
And also, though, you have the very different sensibilities. I mean, America at the time was very different from France at the time.
Oh yeah, that is a great point. Yeah, much more practical and things like that. Not as maybe, flaunty like as France.
I mean,
She's also not smiling.
you get the impression that there's a lot more yardage of fabric that Garfield is swathed in, as opposed to this lady.
Mhm.
This lady, the fabric is, I mean, it's not rationed in any way, shape, or form, but it's beautifully used. With
Mhm.
Garfield, it's like, wow, she's in there somewhere.
Yeah, the different approaches. So, all right. So anyway, those were the pastels. Oh, let's see. Got a request to go back to. All right, so here you go again. Those pastels that Manet did. So there's dozens of these that he did, mostly women, but a few men. And just really like these a lot. They're just really, really cool. So anyway, some examples of those, and let's continue on. All right, so we're in the home stretch of our program, and here's another still life that Manet did. So you can see he passed away in 1883. This is from 1882. This is a whole series of floral paintings that Manet did in the final year and a half of his life.
Yeah, we have people again finding the glass here, really absorbing. He really has a way with glass.
Yeah, it's really beautifully done. So a lot of people have, I'm not into the whole psychoanalysis thing, art, but some people are like, oh, okay, well, he's dying. He's depicting all these flowers, and flowers are a symbol of both life and death. And is there any meaning of that? I'm not sure. What happened was, in the later stages of his life, he was so physically ill that he was not able to leave his apartment. And so the word kind of got out that he was dying. And so he was getting a lot of visitors. People were basically coming to pay their respects before he passed away, because the last many months of his life, his health really, really went downhill quickly. So people would bring him these flowers, and instead of just, sitting on the couch or taking naps all day, he's continuing to paint. But this is what he's painting. So he did numerous floral scenes like this. And so this is a classic example. And so when you see this artwork by Manet, and again, if you were to see this in a museum, and okay, yeah, he made this nice painting of flowers, but if you didn't know kind of the context behind him putting these flowers together in painted form later in life, and again, he's really big into still lifes. So we saw 5 examples today at the National Gallery of Art. And then the paintings by subject. Remember, now this is just strictly the 17 paintings at the National Gallery of Art, but remember, 6 of them of the 17 were these genre scenes, still lifes, 5 of 17, portraits, 4 of 17, then he did a couple of the dogs. And this is pretty representational of his whole entire career. I'd love to have the time to go look at every single painting that Manet did and categorize them, but I haven't gotten around to that just yet. Maybe someday. So the National Gallery of Art collection is really kind of representational of the subjects that he painted throughout his life. And then again, here's the still life, and as Patty mentioned, and people in the audience, yeah, these beautiful crystal vases that he's using to put the flowers in is a really nice touch as well. Look at the beautiful colors. We don't see the blacks on these.
We have a
typically.
question, Robert, about are these florals named?
Well, I mean, every painting has a name. I mean, it's just called
Okay.
flowers in a crystal vase. If
Okay.
that's what you mean.
I think that's what the question was getting at. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, every usually artwork gets named by somebody.
It doesn't have a dramatic, distinct name.
No, 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 no. Unfortunately not. Just flowers in a vase, flowers in a crystal vase. So again, he's doing these the whole final 12 to 18 months of his life. And you can see these examples, and I've seen these in museums all over the world. So, okay, this is the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. This version is at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. This one's at a museum in Japan. This one's at the Dallas Museum of Art for our friends in Texas. And so if you were to see one of these paintings at a museum, like, oh, okay, that's nice. He did a flower painting, but he did a whole batch of these, and it's because of his physical condition. And, you know, another thing that's really impressive, he does so many flower paintings. You got to know that, wow, he had a lot of people coming to see him in the later stage. So he was just very well respected in the art community, but then also with, again, the writers and the musicians and politicians and things like that. So this one's at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, flowers in a crystal vase, bouquet of flowers. Sometimes the titles of paintings, to go back to the previous question, are from the artists themselves. Sometimes they're from the dealers that sell the art. Sometimes they're from the museums that own the paintings. So the titles really come from a variety of sources.
And sometimes those that don't have very distinctive titles will also be accompanied by the date, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sometimes. Well, yeah, this one is really spectacular. Oh, go ahead, Patty.
So that you can keep track of the provenance.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, this one is not too far from where I used to live in Dallas, Texas. And so there you go, these final still lifes he was doing in the later stage of his career. And then here's
gorgeous, but that one on the right is so dramatic.
Yeah, that one does have the black colors in it that we talked about before. So kind of interesting comparison and contrast between these. This one, I really like the glass face here. That's really spectacular as well. So really nicely done. Then this is the one at the National Gallery of Art in DC. And so the next time you see a flower painting from the later stages of Manet's career, you'll know what was going on in his life at that time. And very colorful. And so those are the later years of Manet's life. So, all right, so let's talk about a few other things, then we'll call it a day. So just kind of in postscript, Manet was born. We have a few more things to go over. So we're not done just yet, but kind of wrapping things up. So Manet, born in January of 1832. Starting last year, we had these programs kind of celebrating his life for his 190th birthday that have continued on for the past 12 plus months. He passed away April 30th, 1883. And here's a picture of him. So, you know, looks like, again, very dapper and distinguished gentleman. Now, Manet, while he's really famous and one of the most famous artists, he's in some regard maybe not as famous as some others. But one reason why that is his life was a little bit cut short. So I made this chart so you can see, okay, Manet, he died at the age of 51. And look at kind of some of his contemporaries to see how long they lived and how they were able to make art for much, much longer. So for instance, Cézanne, he lived to be 67. Renoir lived to be 78. Mary Cassatt lived to be 82. Degas lived to be 83. And Monet, he lived to be 86. I mean, as great as and influential and important as popular of an artist as Manet is, imagine how much more so that would have been if he would have lived another 10, 15, 20 years, like some of his contemporaries were able to do so.
You could draw the conclusion from that chart, Robert, that painting is good for your longevity.
Yeah, you know, that's a good point. We all need to start painting so we can live to our long, ripe old age life. So yeah, good point. Unless you're Van Gogh, would disagree with that. And so would Modigliani.
Yeah.
But Picasso, yeah, he would think that, and Matisse would say, yeah, very true. So yeah, that's a good point. As I mentioned in the beginning, so Manet, born and raised in Paris, lived there for his entire life with a few minor exceptions when he was on extended vacation. So his birthplace is just across the Seine from the Louvre here, and then where he's buried in the cemetery is just across the Seine from the Eiffel Tower. So when you go on your upcoming trip to Paris and you're visiting the Eiffel Tower, you can go for a short walk to the cemetery and go visit Manet's gravesite and pay your respects. Now, it's maybe not quite as elaborate as you might expect. It's, you know, it's pretty nice, but it's not pretentious or anything like that. It has a nice sculpture of him on his gravesite. And there he is.
On that walk too, you can stop in at the Musée d'Orsay.
Yeah, I mean, you know, just go to Paris to go see Jim Morrison's gravesite. You might have to go see Manet's while you're in the city as well. Why not? And then someone asked earlier, how much are his paintings worth? So let's talk about that. So this is the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, and this is the Édouard Manet painting known as Spring from 1881. And what he was going to do was a series of 4 paintings where he was going to depict a beautifully dressed young woman to represent each of the 4 seasons. He only ended up doing spring and summer. And so he didn't finish the 4 series, unfortunately, because he passed away. This one was done later in his life. So this is done in 1881. He passed away in 1880, but it's also one of his most famous paintings if you've seen this one before. And it's really beautiful to see in person at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. And if you're curious, looking at all these paintings, saying, wow, I'm going to go out and buy like 3 or 4 of these Manet paintings and, you know, hang them up in my house. You know, what would that cost? Well, it's hard to say because the values of paintings and artwork really varies a lot from work to work and year to year and stuff. But that being said, the most expensive painting ever sold was this one on the left, when the Getty Museum acquired it in November of 2014 for $65 million. So that's the most that was ever recorded in a sale. And, you know, of course, that was several years ago, inflation being what it is. $65 million would be a lot more in 2023 money. But anyway, that's the most that a Manet painting has ever sold for, $65 million for Spring. And if you want to learn more about the collection at the Getty, including the Spring painting, later on this summer, I don't know the exact date, but I'll be doing a live stream tour of their collection. I'm probably going to have to split it up into more than one program because the Getty has such an incredible diverse art collection. And also to the museum itself, the architecture structure is really stunning. And then there's the Getty Museum in LA. And there's also the Getty Villa in Malibu, which features mostly like Greek and Roman and ancient art. So at some point in time, we'll do these live streams about the Getty. If you're in Los Angeles, I was thinking at some point in time, maybe we could do actual in-person tour of the Getty because it's really a fabulous place to visit. And I'm currently in Los Angeles for indefinitely. So, but I have to get my work schedule more under control before we can do anything like that. But stay tuned for details. And if you want to join us in our recorded programs, this program is being recorded. It'll be put on our YouTube channel. It'll probably take a couple of days just because we usually have to edit the programs and do kind of some other technical things. But the name of our flagship organization is Washington, DC History and Culture. Thanks to everyone who's joining us from Dallas and New York and London and our friends in Paris, et cetera, et cetera. So thanks so much for being here. But if you want to find more art programs like this, you can check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is Washington, DC History and Culture. And in fact, we had a program just like this last year where we talked about Manet and his artwork that's at the Metropolitan Museum of Artwork in New York. So we won't be repeating the New York Met program anytime in the near future. But that being said, there was a recording of it on our YouTube channel, so find that. And then we have a similar program to this one, but it talks about the collection at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. And that one will be repeated in April. And it'll probably use the same exact Zoom link. I don't know the date for it just yet, so stay tuned for that. But we'll also record that one if you're on YouTube. So you'll have like a chance to have Manet and the Met, Manet at the Musée d'Orsay, and then of course this program's been Manet at the National Gallery Park in Washington, DC. And beginning, we talked about what
Oh, we lost your voice again, Robert.
just in Paris, there his whole life. He began his career as a traditional painter before Impressionism, and significantly influenced by Velázquez and Goya. He's an established artist, mentored many early Impressionists such as Monet, Renoir, and Marceau. His artistic style is somewhat hard to categorize. We've seen that in Painter Modern Life. really focused on these genre scenes, particularly modern contemporary Paris. And then he also did portraits and still lifes, but not really landscapes. And unfortunately, he died at the age of 51. So that's the end of our program. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and thanks for Patty for contributing once again. Greatly appreciate that, Patty. So wish all of you a great rest of your weekend. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye.
Thank you all.